Hey, it's Kip Weston. I've had a lifelong fascination with adventure, whether that's climbing, mountaineering, or even diving into history. I'm obsessed with uncovering stories from extraordinary people. People who break from the average and become outliers. Now I want to share their stories with you. This episode, I'm speaking with John Long. John is a legend in the climbing community and has written dozens of books, articles, and even screenplays around climbing. In the 1970s, John was a part of the Stone Masters. They were a renegade group of climbers who revolutionized climbing with their bold, free spirited approach. Largely based out of California's Yosemite Valley, the Stone Masters were known for their incredible skill, daring ascents, and countercultural lifestyle. They played a crucial role in transforming climbing into a recognized sport. They emphasized style, ethics, and pushing the difficulty. John has great articles and books chronicling his time with that group, and I had a great time discussing his climbing history and his writing process. I've linked some of John's works and books in the description below. So here's my conversation with John Long. You're such a prolific writer, 23 plus books, magazines, screenplays, shows. And I feel like you have just an accomplished career in climbing as well, with First Ascents kind of leading the way in certain other disciplines. Do you see yourself as a writer who climbs or as a climber who writes?
The writing the writing stuff started when I was really young. My mom was a scholar, and she got me involved in reading and all of that. And I started scribbling out crude, like scenario kind of stories when I was, I don't know, 12 years old or something, right? And then I went to college and grad school and studied lit and all that. And then in the meantime, I learned how to climb, and I had a good career doing that. But my climbing, the intense part of my climbing career was 17 to 25, 26, and then I had to, or I wanted to get involved in creative stuff more. And so at that time, this is back really 80s, heyday was in the 70s, and then the 80s, there wasn't, there was no such thing as a pro rock climber.
Right.
There wasn't any sponsorship. I mean, a little bit, but not, you get a rope or something. There's no money in it. So it wasn't sustainable. And there was no climbing gyms. And so the fact is that, I kept going. I kept climbing, what have you, and I was good. And so I was able to keep contributing, but not in the way that I did when I was late teens and early 20s or to my mid 20s. That was the really intense part. And I did most of my, if I did historical stuff, most of it was then.
Yeah.
So the climbing, the writing stuff started before and then carried on afterwards. So I'm much more of a writer who just happened to be good at a sport.
Right. And you mentioned your mom. Was she your biggest influence in getting you into reading and writing at an early age?
Yeah, probably because she always had her nose in a book, and I was always a trouble. I was trouble. So one of the things that she figured out was to try to give me things that were hard enough that would keep me uh, engaged, and I was stubborn, so she'd give me impossible things like a unicycle or whatever, difficult books, so I could find my I could I could be challenged in that way, and it would take my attention away from mischief making, which I was also real good at doing.
Yeah, would like the devil loves idle hands type work?
Yeah, and I always had to have something to do. Classic ADDH or ADHD kid.
Yep. Do you remember, can you point to any books that your mom gave you as a kid that you just dove into or that challenged you in a good way? You're like, "Oh, this is great."
Well, she like Hemingway and Steinbeck both, but the problem is those are fairly mature. Both of them are come at you from a fairly mature sort of angle, and I couldn't really appreciate it when I was reading that stuff. I mean, I was curious by it when I was 15 or 16, but I couldn't really get it, right?
Yeah.
Especially Steinbeck. I mean, his latter stuff. I mean, some of those big sprawling things he did, you could be carried away by the saga esque sort of nature of them, but you know, some of that stuff that he did, in his later days was so subtle that I had to be a full blown adult before I could really get it.
Does making a career out of writing change how you read books too now?
Yeah, yeah, totally. I think it was always that. It was sort of always that way. In fact, there's as I mentioned, I've been doing this. I've been trying to find my way writing stories from as far back as I can remember, and so you're going to approach things forensically, which is not what a general reader is going to do. A general reader is just going to be is just going to drop into the thing, body and soul, and forget that they're reading and let the story take them wherever it will, right?
Yep.
And for like a full immersion into the thing, narrative. And I do that as well, but a light will come on in my head when I come across some particularly interesting little passage or whatever, and I'll flip to forensic mode and start boring into the thing, trying to figure out how this writer accomplished what they did. Like, how did this? I liked whatever happened. How did they pull that off? Right? You start looking at voicing and prose style and syntax and
Right.
word choice and transitions and tone and all the different things. Trying to
Right.
figure out, okay, what is you're not going to here's what makes the whole creative process interesting, and that is normally when you ask somebody, will you explain that to me? What they really are asking is, can you give me a linear causal sequence that I can look at mechanistically and be
Right.
able to replicate and produce X? But you can't do that you can do that up to a point, but you'll never get all the way there, right?
Right. Like
You'll,
a normal supply chain output. Like if
yeah,
I put in Y, I get Z.
right. And what you're looking for is that you can reverse engineer anything to a mechanism,
Yep.
right? And if you can explain it mechanistically, then I can repeat it. I can predict that this thing is going to work well and what have you. And there are certain mechanistic things or stylistic things, the compositional elements, but you'll never get all the way there by
Yeah.
just investigating those things. And that's
Does
what makes literary criticism or trying to forensically figure out, what does this person do here, right? That's what makes it so interesting, is that it's not cut and dry in the way that a lot of things appear that they are cut and dry. I mean, what is, not wanting to get out too far off base here, but there's recently been a revolution in science too. A couple of years ago, somebody won the Nobel Prize. Physicists won the Nobel Prize for being able to demonstrate there's no local reality. Meaning nothing is locally real. Meaning nothing is fixed in time and space in the way that our consciousness tells us it is. Right? It isn't. And if you reduce things all the way down, you get down to nothing. You're like, oh, okay, right. So basically, what they're saying now is that space and time are not fundamental at all. So what do you do with the mechanistic, materialistic view that all of us grew up with? And what are you saying? I can't grab this coffee cup and take a drink? No, what they're saying is all of us mind. It's not. None of it has to do with the standalone, separate, objective world that we live in. It doesn't exist in that way.
Right. That's so interesting. Where you so you're saying that in some ways, maybe like the engineers of the world want to prove you can see the universe in this way, but really it's
Yeah,
more of the creative approach that allows us to see the world in the way we see it.
yeah, and your consciousness is a big part of that the thing is, when you bring that in, everybody there's a huge faction in the world will go, that's some woo-woo magic, new age, whatever. What's actually turning out to be the case is the belief that there's a standalone, independent, objective world that's out there that we're born into and we die from. That's actually, well, how does that, there's nothing to support that, right? Other than our mind telling us that this is, this is like this, but it isn't. And getting back to the storytelling part, we want to be able to mechanistically be able to, I'm gonna take a literature class, and I'm gonna internalize all the rules of composition, and I'm gonna work up my vocabulary, and I'm gonna get jiggy with all the big issues, and I'm gonna sit down and I'm gonna write like a champ. How often has that worked?
Yeah, it's interesting. Is that frustrating for you as a writer where if you have to do a certain level of output in your writing and there really isn't a like one set formula for the creative process, is it tricky for you to be so productive as an author if you can't replicate your writing style?
Well, you're going to replicate it to some extent because you can't invent a new way to do things every time out. It's going to be recognizably, you're going to use the same technique. But the thing that makes the writing thing interesting is, can I keep exploring new ways to be able to approach whatever subject matter I'm coming across? Granted, I've learned that the way that I'm made is best utilized in going in sort of this direction.
Yep.
Like some people are really good with facts and figures or data or whatever, and those are going to be your journalists, right? And other people are better with more nebulous kind of subjective material, and those are going to be probably your people that are better at doing narrative writing, storytelling. Not necessarily, it's not necessarily so, but tends to be that because you got basically two different approaches that you can take in writing stories. One is sort of fact driven, which is the journalistic approach, and over here you have experiential stuff, which is the narrative approach. Not that either one is mutually exclusive. Literary nonfiction is going to be sort of somewhere in the middle, but people that are better with info and data generally are better at doing journalism.
That makes sense to me. Could you talk if or how growing up in Indio, California affected what literature you were exposed to?
Yeah, I didn't actually grow up in India. I was born there and spent, I was there for a while.
Okay.
You go back there, I mean, it was really nothing when I was there, right?
Yep.
My mom was from there, born there, and my grandfather immigrated there or not immigrated, but moved there from like Missouri in the, I don't know, the 20s maybe, way back when. But I grew up in a Hispanic, rich kind of multicultural thing. And I got married to a Venezuelan and spent a bunch of time down there. And my house is there. My kids were born in Venezuela. So I've sort of had a foot in both those cultures all along. And I don't know if I can, like with any, I'm not sure I can say exactly what the result of that is. So it's such an immersive kind of thing. It's
Yep.
like how how did this affect that? I don't know. I mean, you're part of both, and you're part and you're neither.
Yeah.
So if I was in Venezuela, I was clearly an American.
Yep.
Even though everybody knew that I was sort of there, and my kids were there, and my wife was, all of that. And I'd be up here, and it was, as a climber, an adventure person, a writer, you're not going to ever be a match fit in the culture because you're just made different anyway. Not any better, certainly, but different. So Can you explain those experiences in terms of an Anglo or Latino or the mixed thing, or
Right.
I don't know. Yeah, I
Do you
mean they're
think
both big influences, but to what extent, and like ratio wise, you got me.
do you think growing up around a different culture in some way led to you wanting to see even more cultures? You're like, "Oh, this is kinda neat. What else is out there? Let's go to Borneo.
Yeah,
Let's do all these other things."
I think there's, when I think about it, there's probably three things. The multicultural thing. There's probably three factors that contributed to where I ended up, and one is I was just I was just born around Hispanics, Anglos. I was Those things were always around me, right? So I heard Spanish and English and all the rest of it, from the get go. The second thing is what I liked, and there are two things I really liked, and one was sports. And if you're involved in sports like I was from a super early age, you're going to have blacks and Hispanics and whoever
Yep.
is good at stuff is going to be in these groups, these all-star baseball teams and all the rest of it. And that wasn't decided. There's a lot, I was in an Anglo-centric culture, so the Anglos were going to have the edge on the better jobs and the positions of power. But when you got to sports, that was all performance based,
Mm,
and it didn't matter if you were good at it, you were going to be in there, and it couldn't discriminate. And so I was around all kinds of different folks and cultures and what have you, just because they were into it too. And the second thing was, I originally was most infatuated with music. I grew up playing music, and that's another of the, because I like jazz, and that was another culture that there was all kind of different people involved, and so
yeah.
those three factors meant I was going to be, even though I grew up in a very white kind of atmosphere, I was mingling with all kinds of different cultures and what have you from the beginning, not intentionally. It was just where my interests lie, whatever. And
Yep.
the things that I like to do, people were streaming in from all the corners, right? And so when I went to New, Irian Jaya, New Guinea, Borneo, all those other wild places, I didn't go there thinking, oh, here's my chance to be able to rub elbows with other cultures. No, I just went there because it sounded neat and it was
Right.
interesting, and
Yeah.
incidentally there were all kinds of different cultures, and that went without saying, and I never even thought about it because I was used to doing that anyway.
Yep.
I wasn't seeking out other cultures. I just went to places that sounded interesting, it sounded like there were cool people doing cool things, and they happened to be different than the way that I looked or whatever my background. So
Sure.
yeah, it was. I mean, there's no accounting to taste, and even I can't describe, why I like what I like. I just do.
Yeah. What sports were you involved with growing up?
Mainly baseball.
Okay.
Yeah, I wanted to be a pro baseball player and was good at it, but not that good.
Not good enough for pro?
I mean, you cannot believe how good those people are. I mean, I had guys that I played with in high school that were so good because I grew up in an area where it was baseball centric like crazy, right?
Yep.
And I mean, there's special programs and all-star teams and pro coach. I'm Southern California, man. I think that's where a lot of baseball players come from. And the guys that I grew up with, there was a couple that were. I mean, when I was in high school, we had a really good team. I played for a 5A or 4A school, which is big.
Yep.
We went to state championships and all that stuff. But there were a couple of guys that when we were practicing, whenever they took batting practice, everybody would stop just to watch them hit. I mean, the sound of the bat, the ball cracking off the bat, and then these rifle shots off the bat. You just like, how does anybody do that, right? freaking thing with, and neither one of those guys made it all the way to the big leagues. They got way up into the minor leagues, but never. And they were so good you could not even believe it. The idea that somebody could always, make it all the way to the big leagues, then on top of that, be a star in the big leagues, man, that's another another realm, and that's why when I first went to Yosemite and saw the best climbers, I knew these are those guys.
Right.
Right. That
Yep.
handful of people that have managed to somehow or another be the first people to climb El Cap and all the rest of that stuff. I go, that's those guys. I want to be one of those guys.
Yeah, like there's varsity and then there's these guys.
Yeah, these guys. And that's a way bit different kind of league because I'd seen it in other sports.
Can you lay out what the climbing scene looked like before you got into it or when you got into it? Or rather like the absence of a climbing scene?
No, there was one. There was a big climbing scene, and there always had been. And it wasn't very many people, but there had been, reaching back to the 40s, there had been people who had taken this whole thing on as a special project and did a whole lot of things in the Sierras and the Swangunks, Takis and Suicide, and so there was a big tradition. There just wasn't very many people doing it, but it was recorded in Sierra Club journals and American Alpine Club. It was a legitimate group of people doing things, and it had a heritage, and it was cross-pollinated with what was going on in Europe and this and that. As I said, the main thing about it was insular and very small, but it was developed. And people had pushed the standards up. And by the time I got there, it was already breaking into the athletic mode. People had Verape shoes and, chalk and the rest of it. And it was just on the cusp of breaking into a form that was similar to what it is now. Right.
Right.
It just there wasn't a whole lot of people. So if you were ambitious and skilled and you went to the right place and you had time and enough resources to stay with it, you too could, you could be a player in that world.
How are you introduced to that world?
I always liked things that looked dangerous and, thrilling and thrill seeker, right? So
Yep.
Adrenaline guy and like stimulation. I like being outdoors. That's why I like baseball instead of basketball or a lot of those other things for indoor. I like being outdoors. I just always did. And I remember my mother got National Geographic. And I got one of those. She got one of those issues that had like Leighton Core and was it Ingalls climbing like the Titan or something, and it was on the cover. It's like in the 60s. I was just a little kid. I remember looking at that thing going, I want to do that. That looks wild. That looks so fun, And I didn't know. I mean, how do you go about doing it? There were no there were climbing clubs, but I didn't know about them. I didn't know how to go about them. I didn't have a car, couldn't drive. My dad was a doctor, didn't have anything to do with any of that stuff. So I guess what it was is I went on a river trip down the Grand Canyon it was a Salmon River with a YMCA group when I was 15. And I liked it so much, I begged the boatman that owned the company for a job. He goes, I'll give you a job. I can't pay you anything, but you can come along if you work. So I went to work that summer on the Grand Canyon, taking rafts down the Grand Canyon.
Yep.
I was only 15 and I was just a punk kid. And I just cleaned pots and, did menials, help cook and that kind of stuff. But I got to go down the Grand Canyon a bunch. And one of the trips we went down was a Sierra Club trip. And somebody described to me what climbing was about. And I go, I got to figure out how to do this. It sounds so wild, right? So I went back home and there was a local backpacking shop. And there was somebody that was teaching little, on the side, would teach people how to climb. Granite Mountain Guide Service, but there wasn't any. It wasn't an organized group. There was just a couple of people showing you how to tie in, or they'd take you out. So I paid the $20, and the guy was really good, actually, really good instructor. I learned the basic stuff, and I bought the gear, and I recruited a couple of people from my high school, Rick Akamasa and Richard Harrison. Richard was already doing it. I don't know how I have no idea how he figured out how to do it, but he did. And then we got together really early. We were like 16, barely 16, and started, practicing in a local area, and then found the other people, far and wide that were doing it. And then, a group of us formed into another group called the Stone Masters, and they were, everybody was real psyched, and there were some very good athletes, and they're really ambitious, and it just sort of grew from there.
Yeah,
how homegrown kind of thing, right? And taking from surrounding groups and organizations and what have you. We didn't really belong in any of those. We're too rebellious and unruly, so we just formed our own group.
Just reading about it reminded me there are a lot of parallels to like early skateboarding. It felt like, just kind of misfits in a good way, productively doing something that
and they found something to love, and so it was easy to get good at something if you were doing it all the time, right. But we had a group, we had a bunch of venues, because we're in Southern California. There's all kinds of places to climb, right? There wasn't gyms, but you could go I could go bouldering every day, and did.
And you spent a ton of time. You spent is this where you met a lot of the stonemasons? Was in Joshua Tree, or is it just in Yosemite?
No. Joshua Tree.
Joshua Tree, right? Yeah.
The main area for us growing up was Rubidoux, which is right down the street, and that was a bouldering area, or top roping, small little area.
Yeah.
So I went to Suicide and Talkeetna a couple of times, but I got overmatched. I got scared because the stuff was too big. We didn't know what we were doing, really. So we just stuck with Rubidoux for about 6 months. And there was enough climbers going there on weekends and what have you, top roping, and we just learned all the little stuff, and then got introduced, because people have been climbing there for 20 years. So we got good at all the regular things and start doing new things. And, one thing led to another. And we got really strong, really fast. Mm-hmm. And then by the time we went summer or spring or whatever came, and we could go back to Suicide and Talkeetna, we started doing a 5-10 right off, because we were good, and then we just shut off from there. But a lot of it had to do with the fact that we broke in at a practice area, and in practice areas, you're going to be doing things way harder than you're going to do on the rock, at least back then, because people didn't go up and keep falling off things like they do now. The protection wasn't good enough normally, and so it was a different kind of approach. But at a practice area, you could, all we did was fall until we didn't, you got good enough to where you could start doing things. And by that time, we were doing things way harder than people were doing on a rope. And by the time we went back to rope climbing, we were getting it done.
That's awesome. How did you end up initially at Camp 4 in Yosemite?
Well, when I first went up there in the early 70s, it was already established that was the world, the focal point for rock climbing worldwide. If you wanted to do, at that time, the hardest, longest, biggest, most badass stuff rock climbing wise, you went to Yosemite, because it had the big rocks, it had the good weather, and the days were long, and it was reasonably affordable and convenient. You didn't have to go to Pakistan or whatever. It was right there.
Yep.
And it had Camp 4, which was a climbers camp even back then. So there was already a community of people that lived in an area. You could just go right to it.
You spent 8 summers there at Camp 4?
Yeah, in a row.
How does the crowd change from summer 1 to summer 8?
Mainly the numbers. When I first went there, what it was the best. There were already a whole bunch of climbing areas spread across the United States. And when I first went there, it was the best, most dedicated people from all of those areas went to Yosemite, and from those people that went there, there was a couple dozen that were good, like solidly good, right? And once we started climbing together and what have you, you know, I mean the standard just went shooting right up. I mean, you know, so and that all happened. The big, you know, a lot of like the difference in ability and what was getting done between 1972 and 1975 or 6 was giant.
Yeah.
When I first went there in 72, 73, there were a few people doing hard, like 511-ish stuff, you know, with sort of weird gear and shitty shoes.
Yep.
By say 78, when sticky rubber shoes came and then Friends, I mean, it was blown up. It went from a few people doing 511 to the best people doing 512 all the time. That's a giant leap, right?
Is that a lot of result of like sharpening iron, just the competition and you all pushing each other?
Yeah, it was that, and then there's two technological breakthroughs that made a huge difference. And that is camming devices, which made the protection completely, passive nuts were always a little sketchy, man. Especially on parallel sided stuff. You had to have a bottleneck to fit a nut in. And if there wasn't one there, what do? You just got to run the rope. And you're not going to do that on really hard stuff. You just weren't, right? Now you can get with camming devices, usually get moderately good to bomber pro just about anywhere, right? That opened up the game completely. And then sticky rubber shoes. Those made a giant difference. So those two things plus the intensity and the intensity of the climbing scene and the talent pool is getting bigger, exponentially bigger. But what really did it was it's just like anything else. The other things that I've done, writing, music, any kind of sport things, it boils down to reps. Always. How many reps could you get in? And every one of those, every year, the best people were doing more climbing than anybody had ever done before them. And nowadays, you look at somebody there was just yesterday, I was watching it, the World Cup sport climbing lead finals in Chamonix. I think it's the last World Cup climbing meet before the Olympics, which is, I think it starts in, what is 15? It starts in
late
11
August,
days.
right?
11 days.
Yeah.
It's July 26th, I believe, and it's
Okay.
now July 15th. So got 11 days. That was the last meet. Everybody's going to go home and regroup, and then boom, off to the Olympics. You look at any of those people in the finals, and they're going to be somewhere between their mean average age is probably 22, right? Any of those people in the finals, without exception, would have started in a gym in a youth program when they're 8 years old or 7 or 6, right?
Yep.
And by the time they've gotten to where they are now, you're talking somebody 22 that's been climbing all the time for 15 or 16 years, right?
Yeah, I see what you're saying.
Not just a little bit. I'm talking after school, every day for years.
Right.
And
they've hit their 10,000 hours
in
their discipline.
Way more than that, right? And
and
it's those people that have the people that get there are the genetic nut, freaky. All of that people, you don't realize that how many people are climbing in gyms? You know how many people are in youth programs worldwide? Millions, actually, at this point. If you end up with 6 people in a final, those people are genetic freaks. They're the people that have the body type that can do this kind of strenuous stuff with the balance and the explosive strength and the endurance, and they have a body that is capable of working out hard enough to get that good and can continue to do that. Like a lot of people don't have a body that can train that hard. It'll just break down, right?
Yeah.
These people can actually train hard enough and keep getting better without getting chronically injured. That's another big part of it, you know. But the coaching and the this and that, I mean, they know how to do it. It's like third or fourth generation now. So, I mean, those people are so freaking good. But getting back to my original point is they've climbed way more than everybody else. They've gotten all these reps in over the decades that have put them in this position. And that's what my generation did to a much
Yep.
lesser degree, is we just climbed way more than anybody else did. You know, people used to go, when I first started, even the best climbers, they go up to a sport crag, and, you know, we go up to Talkies and Suicide, or out to Joshua Tree, which is very little, you know, rocks out of Joshua Tree are higher than even 100 feet high, right? Somebody would do 2-3 routes a day, you know, leisurely. We go out there and do like 20 routes, right? Not super hard ones, but we did a lot of them. And then
Yeah.
later we got to where we were concentrating on a few, you know, really hard ones. But that's what happened, is people just started doing more and more and more and more and more. And finally became, there was, the money was there were sponsorships, the gear was good, the coaching was there, the diet, the this, you know, all of it. They had programs. So as opposed to a few malcontents that were athletic, they could go to Yosemite for 3 or 4 months a year and get, you know, a lot of reps in and climb in the winter as they could. You got a group of dedicated people starting in what, the late 80s, I guess, you know, and it's just been more of the same up until now. And, you know, you look at those people now, they're so good. They're resting on, you know, last digit holds on a 35-degree overhanging wall. If they can get something on their last knuckle on something, they'll lock it off and shake out the other hand and switch. And I mean, nobody could do that until this, you know, that was unheard of.
How did your body, speaking of these physical changes, how does your body change when you do 8 summers in a row at Yosemite?
That's about all I could take because I weighed a lot. You know, I always weighed 200 pounds.
'Cause you're a big
Nobody
guy.
weighed.
You're 6'2".
Yeah.
Yeah.
And I weighed 205 was my natural weight. And I get up to Yosemite, I could, you know, starving and doing wall climbing and hiking and all that. I could get down to like in the low 190s, but I could never stay there because my set point was higher and I always felt I was starving, right?
Yeah.
So as soon as I could eat it back on, I would.
Right.
Um, and so you know, for the old style adventure climbing and some boulder, you know, like explosive dynamic bouldering, I could hang. But I didn't have the right body for doing, like, especially nowadays. Nobody weighs 205 pounds climbing
Yeah.
hard sport climbing. You weigh too much. You know, I weigh too much. Nowadays, I'd have to, if I wanted to be world class if I was born now, I'd have to go into alpinism.
Mhm.
Wouldn't be able to do it rock climbing, but I like rock climbing. So, you know, I came along for the kind of physique that I had. I came along at just the right time because
Yeah.
I could get away with being world class and being that big for a minute. But, you know, as soon as I stepped out of trying to be the best rock climber in the world, which we all tried to do for a while, as soon as I got off of that train, you know, all of a sudden it was just thin man material.
What's your relationship like with aging? Is it tricky to, like, "Oh, this used to take me I didn't even have to think about recovery doing this,
Yeah,
and now
yeah.
I have to think about it."
Yeah, that's an interesting, like, you're never going to solve it, right? I mean, you don't usually, like, I was just reading a book, a Pulitzer Prize winning book by Ernest Becker called the Denial of Death. And it's not, you know, it's something when I was younger, I never thought about, or I never thought much about it, but it's always underneath there, right?
Yep.
People that go, yep, I'm going to die one day, but you can't get your head around it, right? But as you start getting older, you start, like, I still go climbing, you know, a bunch, right?
Yeah.
But I can't, like you were saying, I got to warm up. I got to be careful. I can't do, you know, I can still climb sort of hard, but nothing like I used to. I'm not even interested in doing that. But, you can see your performance level start, and you know the end is coming. There's a couple of different ways to approach that. One is you can do the transcendent angle, which is meditation and the rest of it, to be able to see, oh, you're looking at what you because I've done that all along, and what you come to realize is that none of us were alive in the way we think we are anyway, right? There
What do
was
you mean by
never.
that?
That's a hard one to explain. I don't even want to try to do it. Right?
Okay. Yep.
Okay. But the other angle is you just existentially just come to grips with, yeah, you make the best of what you can do while you're here, because that's all you can do, right? So, but if you approach it from two angles, then it becomes really an adventure. Right? Every day is
Mm.
going to be an adventure, because you have no, they always had said, psychologists and what have you, anthropologists always said that our kryptonite is uncertainty. And if you embrace that, then life becomes, it's always going to be adventurous. But you're always going to be a little bit on edge, because you were not made to deal everything you can think about that we do as humans and in society is to try to eliminate uncertainty. But you never can. So if you embrace it, then your whole experience becomes sort of fundamentally different.
That makes sense to me, especially with your adventure-seeking temperament. I could see that outlook.
Well, that's what adventure is. I mean, that
Right.
was one of the questions you sent me. What is an adventure? And that is, you don't, the ultimately the end, how how this is going to turn out is undetermined
Mm.
at the beginning. You never know where this is going. So that's basically, you're jumping into something that's completely uncertain. The more uncertain it is, the bigger the adventure.
I love that definition.
Yeah, that's what I understood it to be from the beginning. So if you're going to a place you don't know, and you're going into an area that's unmapped with people you've never heard of, you're committing yourself to a big piece there.
Because there's so much you can't plan for.
What you have to have established data to plan.
Yeah.
If there isn't any, what do? You just go there and see what happens.
I love that. I'd love to ask you about your formal education as well. You studied humanities at college, and if Wikipedia, which is usually right, you studied theology for graduate school,
Yeah, philosophy.
philosophy.
Humanities, and I did a bunch of philosophy too. Yeah, stuff has just interested me. I
Yeah,
did mainly lit as an undergrad, literature.
yeah.
Uh, if I had it to do again, I probably would have gone to a college that had a formal creative writing program,
Mhm.
um, which is more of a hands-on. You're doing more creative writing itself rather than just studying people that have people's stories, literature.
Right.
So I sort of had to go back into it from, like, oh, I read all this stuff, but I didn't have all that much formal education on writing itself.
Mm.
I had some for sure, right? And then later, once I got started, I had the great fortune of working with some really good editors. So that was, I probably learned more doing that than I did in school.
Yeah. In maybe going back to earlier in terms of just getting as much output in climbing as you can, is there a parallel to writing that you
Oh yeah,
experienced in those early years where it's just like,
yeah, the
I
rep.
gotta,
You need to go. You need to get a lot of reps, and you got to crank out a lot of material.
yep,
All right. One is, you're never going to figure out what you're never going to settle into your own voice unless you do a lot.
mm,
Uh, I wouldn't say never. Maybe some people come along and they just naturally just find it. I didn't. It took me forever. I did eventually, but it took a lot of writing. And I had to write myself out of a lot of bad habits. Um, So yeah, the reps are really, that's a huge part of that. Uh, and then feedback. You have to get a lot of good feedback from a lot of different people, and then you can sort of see, okay, I'm naturally going, uh, I'm going in this direction, and you need to do that. And the reason why is, um, well, let me give you an example. What was her name? Aretha. Yeah, Aretha Franklin. You know the R&B singer,
Yep.
jazz singer Aretha Franklin. Got to be one of the best ever, right?
Yep.
Like like an all-time great genius level voice. She signed on, I believe it was RCA Records when she was like 19, and they hooked her up with some people and wrote some songs. They did 2 or 3 albums. They didn't sell anything, and they RCA is like, "Hey, Ruthie, you're a talent. We know you are, but we can't sell your records, man. So we're gonna have to drop you." So some agent knew that she was a world class talent, got a hold of her. Go, I'm taking it down to Muscle Shoals, these hayseeds down in wherever it is, Georgia or something. They had a studio, and they'd work. Eventually, ended up working with everybody, right? Rolling Stones. I mean, it just all these big names. Everybody wanted to work with the musicians down in Muscle Shoals. Anyway, they got Aretha down there, and they listened to the in-house musicians there. Listen to what she's been doing. Listen to her sing. Listen to her albums. And you're doing that. They go, no, no, no. That's the wrong stuff. They figured out some stuff for her to do. She collaborated with that. They did an album. It was a platinum album right off. And what it goes to show you is even Aretha Franklin can't do anything. You have to do the right material for your skill set.
Right.
You can't just write anything. You got to figure out what you're good at and go in that direction. And it took me a while to figure that out, right? And once I did, then it was a matter of developing that particular style that seemed most natural to me, and looking far and wide for other people that had done stuff that was similar that I could learn from.
Mm. Who were your mentors that you could learn from?
It's a great question. I mean, I'm not sure any writer can reliably reverse engineer their writing process back to that's the source, right?
Mm.
But I know for certain there were certain writers, not so much certain writers, but specific works of certain writers that when I read stuff, something clicked and I go, okay, I'm there's something there. I've got to keep looking into this because that person did something that I relate to, right?
Right.
And
Like,
I know that I got a sense for this thing, right?
mm.
That thing's talking to me, right? And I can. There are a handful of things that I can go look at and I can mention specifically. One of the first things I that really clicked for me was a book that Kipling did early on called Plain Tales from the Hills. And it was simply drafted character sketches of people that he had run into when he was working for a newspaper in India. But the delivery, the way that he wrote those stories, it was a human interest thing about somebody, and it was wrapped around a series of events that happened, anecdotal, basic stories that illuminated a character. I go, and it had a conversational style that just sucked me right in. I go, that's genius, man. How is that person doing that? Right. So I reread that thing a million times until I figured out, had some feel for what he was doing. Another one, that a person that had done the same thing in a slightly different style was a book called Tales from the South Pacific by Michener,
Mm.
and that was a book that the Rodgers and Hammerstein musical was based on, which Michener won a Pulitzer Prize for, which he wrote about his World War II experiences, but in the same way Kipling had done, which was they were all character studies about somebody, right? And it was about a plane went into the ocean and there was a rescue operation and they saved this person, or this happened over here, this happened over there. There are character rich, anecdotal kind of narratives about somebody doing something, right? And
Yeah.
they were and it was they had a naturalness to them. It was pure narrative storytelling, but it was also it was so anchored in people doing interesting things, and it had heart and it had fantastically rich sort of exotica.
Yep.
All of those things just rang a bell to me. Those two things were really influential. And off to the side was in the same way, what I was also reading a bunch of was Arabian Nights, Scheherazade, Thousand Nights and a Night. It's like
Mm.
16 volumes, right? But it was all the same thing. Characters, Sinbad. I mean, it was over the top, but it was real imaginative. But it was all a character being involved in some fantastic adventure, right? Or sometimes it wasn't fantastic, but it was always very interesting, right? So I was drawn to that. Kipling and Mishra showed me, okay, this is how you do this, right?
Right.
Right. And then another one that was really influential, and this is early on, was Sherlock Holmes stories.
Mm. Yeah.
And the reason why is because it was how personalized all of that stuff was between Sherlock Holmes and Watson,
Right.
right? And I go, oh, it was all personalized, right? Okay. But then the other thing, the big shift was, how do I do this in first person,
Mm.
right? Because the and that was two steps, and there was two books that were really influential on that, and that is the first person that I saw that I saw a work that somebody had done. It was just so wildly first person, was Bell Jar by Sylvia Plath. When I read that, I'm like, wow, that's somebody, they ripped themselves open, right?
Mm.
That's what first person. But the problem with that was it was fiendishly self-absorbed, which is always the curse of writing in first person. It can feel so self-absorbed that it gets in the way of things, right? So how do you have that level of intimacy with Plath had in the Bell Jar, but without it being self-absorbed? And the person that I learned that from, how to do that, was A.J. Liebling in a book called The Sweet Science, which is about boxing.
Mm.
And the way that he managed to do it was he was always in the middle of it, because he was doing interviews with boxers, and he was describing going to boxing matches and all that stuff. But the way that he got past being self-absorbed was he didn't make it all about him. He
Yeah.
made it about everybody around him too. He was
Right.
just embedded in it. And he was always allowed himself to be honestly amused by what was going on around him. So it never felt like it was self-absorbed, ever.
I could see that. When I read something like The Only Blasphemy, it does feel like a boxing match. You're describing, I won this round, but I'm getting beat up in the second
Yeah,
round,
yeah.
and I'm on the
But it wasn't
ropes.
so much the boxing, so to speak. It was the way that Liebling approached the thing, which was
Yeah.
what was happening. It wasn't interesting because it was me. It was interesting because what was happening was interesting.
Yep. Hey, I want to be respectful of your time, so I have two questions for you. I want to do a fun little speed round. So first is, if I want to introduce someone to John Long's writings, where should I start? What's the go-to recommendation?
I would say Rogue's Atlas is probably the best one. That's the one, a recent book that I did on flash fiction, which is anything. The only definition of flash fiction is 1,000 words or less. So it's 2 to 3 pages, all of them. And there's 40 stories in there. And you can get, you're going to know all about me by the end of that one.
Okay. Rogues.
Rogue's
Got it.
Atlas.
Rogue's Atlas. Okay.
Rogues, as in, rogue.
Rogue, yeah.
ROGUE, yeah. Hold on.
Oh, is there?
I got and if you wanted to do just a climbing thing, I've recently had another thing come out that
Granite Mariner.
Granite Mariner. That's got all the best climbing stuff I've done. So if you want to just do that, then you can look into that one. You can get any of that stuff online, Amazon.
And where can people find you online? Just Amazon? Do you have your website?
Yeah, no, I don't. I really try to stay off social media. I mean, I know I should be on it, promoting the shit out of myself, but I'd rather just work.
Yep, I get it. Okay, speed round. Least favorite climbing hold?
Ooh, probably tiny crimps. Even though I grew up doing it, I'm just weigh a lot, so they hurt.
Oxford comma, yes or no?
Oxford what?
Oxford comma?
Like
if you
cereal
do-
comma?
Yeah, like after an and or before an and
Yeah.
in a
No,
list? No. Oh, interesting. ATC or Grigri?
ATC. I weigh a lot, so I outweigh everybody, and it's easier for me to feather the ATC than the Gregory. And plus, I don't like carrying all that shit on me.
Scuba or skydive?
Scuba.
Tea or coffee?
Coffee. Are you kidding?
Yeah, I like that answer. Cats or dogs?
Dogs.
Okay, last one. Music outdoors, yes or no?
Music or outdoors?
Music in the outdoors. Like a lot of people have feelings about people playing music on speakers outdoors.
Hey, it's if I'm in a group of people that are into listening to a boombox, I'm good with it.
Yep.
But if I'm at a general crag, like just a generic crag, there's a lot of people there that don't know each other.
Yeah.
That's like bringing a dog to those or a boombox. I think is bad form because you don't know what other people like, and then
Yeah.
you get into my rights or my dog's rights, or it just
Yeah.
ends up, you don't want to intrude on people.
Yep.
When you get right down to it, most people completely have their hands full with their own life, and don't make it harder. It's hard enough.
Yeah, that makes sense to me. So I hope you enjoyed this conversation. I've linked some of John's works below, and go ahead and subscribe to this channel so you can catch some of my latest interviews.